Hello, everyone. Welcome to Libraries in Response, session 145 in our long-running series. I say long-running, it's only in its seventh year, which surprises me because this just started as a response to the pandemic. In March of 2020, we were all going, wow, what happened? What's now? I mean, we're in lockdown. What does that mean? I mean, the whole world changed overnight. Civilization just changed in an instant. That's never happened before. Even world wars take months to unfold, but this just happened everywhere. And AI is kind of like that. I mean, it's a question about what it is and how long it's been around and what it does, but it has kind of swept worldwide more or less at the same time. And so everybody is scrambling. It really feels like a scramble trying to figure out what it means, what it is, what its impact is, and all that. So we began uh, basically as a conversation. Well, okay, the library's building is closed. Does that mean the library is closed? No, there's some things that are available to the library. Okay, well, what are they, and what should they be, and how can the library respond to this new circumstance? So we just suggested have a call to talk about that, and we had I don't know 250 people show up to think about that and talk about that, and so that just sort of kicked us off, and we there was obviously more to talk about as you break down the various library services and wider circumstances. And so we just kind of kept going. And then it evolved into a response to a series, you might even call it a cascade of crises that ensued, or even a polycrisis is a current term of multiple simultaneous crises that libraries have to address. There was a social crisis in well, I think it was the spring of 2020 from the Floyd murder when thousands of people took to the streets to protest this this cruel murder is what it was. And they weren't wearing masks, and so a lot of people said, well, they're out there without masks on and you made it such a big deal about it. So that turned into kind of a political crisis. And then, of course, we had the economic crisis from the shutdown. And then there's always the pervasive climate crisis. And now we have basically a new crisis that AI is presenting to us that where it's just disrupting pretty much everything. And no one really seems to know exactly what it is or what it means. There's not consensus on that. There's a wide range of opinions from, complete doom to total zoom, and everything in between. And, like, what's your prediction of, mass of human extinction, percentage chance the next 5 years? Well, I give it a 15% chance we'll all be gone. 15%, really? Is that, well, what do you do if that's in fact what you believe? I mean, you must do something differently. Well, what? So there's a lot going on out there, a lot of displacement, a lot of worry, a lot of it justifiable. Maybe a lot of it is unjustified. Maybe this is really something that will turn out to have some sort of inherent benevolence. This is a kind of a spiritual approach to this. Excuse me again. Is that left to itself, would AI extinguish humanity? I mean, what principles drive AI actions? pre-existing other than the commands or the specific task that is the prompts is given. Is there an underlying set of principles it draws from? Does it read humanity across all literature, across all media to derive what it thinks humanity's core principles are? It could, but does it do that? Why would it do that? Is it looking for such things? Well, these are just a lot of big, interesting mysteries that are happening, and we're here uh, to talk about them. Just trying to find share here, get the slide up. So, uh, today our title is Humanities in the Time of AI. This is the title of a work by our guest from a year ago, but it really is such a powerful title that captures so much of what's interesting to us right now that we've borrowed it as a title for this session. Thank you, Laurent, who we'll get to momentarily. We are the Gigabit Libraries Network. My name is Don Means. I'm the director here, and we co-produce this series with the International Federation of Library Association Institutions, IFLA, based in The Hague, our longtime partner in public access, universal public access through community hubs like libraries. We think everyone should be proximate to some kind of access point to the world's information, and that the world's 400,000 something public libraries are a really good place to start. It doesn't have to be a library. It could be anything that the community rallies around, but it's that same idea. Uh, we will come back to Laurent, the distinguished professor of arts and sciences at Cornell, and are anxious to hear from him. But first, we must thank our sponsors and supporters, which are 5 state libraries, New Jersey, Texas, Washington, and Delaware. And just added is the Library of Michigan has joined this esteemed, highly valued group of supporters who help guide this program. We seek their opinions, especially on programming and speakers and topics and whatever else. And we thank them so much. This is our kind of our emblem of libraries, well, the world as a group of libraries responding to these threats. This is a cartoon by the Economist, political cartoonist Cal, who's just outstanding in his poignancy and his artwork. And here we have the kind of the modern 4 horsemen. When we started this, war was not so prominent. But looking at this image today, it looks very much more prominent than it was 6 years ago. Well, it is. And at the same time, the pandemic is still with us. There's still people contracting COVID, contracting long COVID. And of course, the climate is relentless, and we are in for some heavy weather, so to speak, for the foreseeable. And this is going to, people end up at the front door of the library when there's a crisis. And crises scale from global to personal. And the library is there for its communities and the people in its communities. This is our go-to image, that the closest thing we could come to that represents the services of a library, a Swiss Army knife. It provides more services to more people than any other institution by far, by far. I mean, libraries will help you with anything you ask them to help you with. and and they won't even ask you if you need help. You walk into a library, and nobody will even ask you a question. Do you need any help? No, they wait for you to come to them, and then they'll work on whatever it is. And they, provide all these historical services, of course, books, but also lots of programming and all kinds of media. And they're evolving with the media constantly. And their demise keeps being predicted, but they just don't seem to succumb to these changes, these technology changes. They're resilient and they provide resilience to their communities. So, this is kind of the nub of what we're hoping to talk about today with Laurent is this arrival of an interest in the humanities from in an area that we have thought of pretty much as technological. So learn to code was once the common career advice. Not that long ago, I mean, months ago, that was still the conventional path to career success. Now it might be learn to read. Wow. Now, why would that be? AI is making humanity majors more important than ever, says Daniela Amodai, the president of Anthropic, who herself has a humanities degree from the University of California at Santa Cruz. And so that's fascinating. I mean, it's really fascinating. There's there is this project that has just been announced in the last few weeks to create a new school in at the University of Texas in Austin that incorporates the computer science, statistics, and information science, or the information library sciences school, into a new school, a new integrated interdisciplinary school that is supposed to be more comprehensive in a way that is somehow being perceived as valuable. For us, the question is, how did this come about? I mean, I've been in computers and software for a long time, community networks. I've worked with a lot of engineers. I am not an engineer, nor am I a librarian, for as far as that goes. But I've worked with a lot of engineers, and my experience is that they generally have little patience for non-engineers, or rather subjective kind of conversations. They like facts and measurable bits of information that they can work with. And yet somehow the need for an understanding of literature, of culture, all these, soft disciplines has arrived as some kind of a missing piece. Well, who recognized that and what did they recognize? It's an open question. Perhaps we can get something of an answer today. So, to our speaker, welcome, Laurent Dubreuil. I'm so sorry I'm not getting your last name correct, so you'll correct me there, and I will stop sharing. And welcome our speaker. Thank you so much, Laurent, for being here and all the work you've done. I've only read about your work, but it's just fascinating to me that uh, all the various things you've done and have written about and helped provide understanding for. Your blurb that you sent us reminded me of the story of Leibniz, whose father locked him in his library, and he taught himself everything by reading all the books in the library, which pretty much was all the knowledge that existed at the time. And I always thought that was, kind of fascinating, a little bit of a horror story, but at the same time, you got there. Uh, and yours sounded a little bit like that, so that must have been a fascinating experience for you. So, welcome. Please give us a little background on how you arrived at this point in your career, and then whatever you'd like to tell us about the topic at hand, about humanities in the age of AI. So, welcome, Laurent.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me and for being here. Um, and I will speak about some ideas stemming from the book and a bit beyond that. But since I was invited by Don to do a sort of autobiographical exercise, as I was thinking of it during the introduction, um, I had this picture of a few years ago. So let's say I'm thinking of myself when I'm 8 years old. That's a good moment. Not that everything you do when you're 8 will determine what you will accomplish afterwards, I hope. But I was thinking age 8 on a sort of autobiographical level plus library. That's the year of the opening of the municipal library, 5 minute walk away from where my parents lived and still live, in fact, in Lyon, because the neighborhood was relatively new. So I became at that point, I had access to books before, but I became at that point a heavy borrower of the library. But when I was 8, I guess two things that were really extremely important for my imagination. One was sci-fi, and especially American sci-fi that was being delivered to us in multiple media, through comics, through movies, through TV series, lots of TV series from the 60s that were on, or even the 50s, like The Twilight Zone, that were on French TV in those years pretty heavily. And where, of course, the question of artificial intelligence, of robots and so on would be absolutely central. And age 8, I really fell in love. It was more than love, it was an obsession with Greek mythology. So let's say I'm 8. I'm in my almost on the outskirts of Lyon. There is a new municipal library. I'm absolutely absorbed by sci-fi and completely caught by Greek things through the myths mainly. But that explains some of the choices I made afterwards. And especially, I usually say that in intellectual terms, the decision to learn classical Greek when I was 12 was probably the most consequential one for me as a scholar. It was coming from the mythology, but it went into philosophy and tragedy pretty importantly. And I did in high school. The high school in France is much more specialized than in the US. I did mainly math and physics. But after that, I moved back to the very traditional polymathic track of the humanities in France, where Greek was there, but lots of philosophy and literature. And of course, my life has been devoted to a large extent to literature and philosophy. But the sci-fi and mathematical background might explain why I took the opportunities. So I arrived in the US in 2005. I was a full professor in 2008 at Cornell. And I got the wonderful opportunity through a Mellon grant to become a student again. And I decided that I would study language, since I was studying language and languages for a long time. But I would study how people in the sciences were now focusing on language. So especially people using formal logic, but especially experimental psychology and cognitive science. So that's what I decided to study for a few years at that time. And it became much more consequential for me than I thought it would be, because I suddenly entered a very different world. And one of the ideas I had, and I still have, still entertain, is that we live through language, we think through language, but we have different accesses, different modes of access to language and to languages. And it is not the case that sort of a banal conversation, a poem, an essay, a post on the internet would shape us in the same way. So this diversity of languages, of language uses was very important to me. And what was important to me, one of the reasons why I wanted to move more into experimental psychology was to look at how language could be used by speakers who are a bit unexpected. So some of them would be people we call neurodivergent, but it could also be human children, since as a human child we learn language in a way that is different from the way we speak it afterwards. That would also include some of the non-human animals who have acquired some competency in language, and I worked and I still work with some great apes, with bonobos, including the most famous of the bonobos, Kanzi, who passed away last year. But I was also very intrigued by how language could be used in a meaningful or non-meaningful way by computers as well. So that's how 15 years ago I moved into a more, that's not the only thing I do, but the most of what I do as a scholar in English, when I write in English, is at the interface of the arts, the sciences, and the humanities, and how we move beyond the boundaries of ordinary thought to reach sometimes something a bit more extraordinary. So it has to do with creation. And in this respect, AI was there. A few years ago, with a colleague of mine who is an experimental psychologist and professor of information science and cognitive science as well, Morten Christiansen, with whom I teach every other year a seminar on culture, cognition, and the humanities, we had this idea, and I'm going to speak about that briefly in a few minutes, of running an experimental setup comparing poetry written in English with poetry written in English by people who are not really the best poets, namely the traditional American college undergrad, and comparing that with what was at the time not very well known outside of information science, but the new GPT-3. So we were conducting that experiment when suddenly ChatGPT became very famous and popular. So we were already working on that is on a stratified view of language, thought, creation, and generation, depending on different levels of expertise and human, non-human, when suddenly the topic became massive. And when I received, for instance, a request from a journalist asking me how I felt with the prospect of being fired very easily next week, since now I would be replaced with ChatGPT. So I almost responded, you might be more at risk than I am, but I didn't do it. I was nice, which doesn't happen very often to me, but at least that day. And that's where we have been working more and more in the structure I created a few years ago, right before the pandemic, in fact, the Humanities Lab, which is a structure where we have artists and researchers, undergraduates, and very confirmed scholars working together, and scientists. In the Humanities Lab, we have been devoting quite some time to the topic of AI and the humanities, and I'm trying to make the case for a certain way of thinking of the humanities right now. And I guess that's the introduction to...
Wow, that's a great story.
Thank you.
Leon is an amazing city, really wonderful city to, I'm
It
sure
is.
to, yeah.
It is.
So you're saying that computer science has discovered it needs information science, information scientists to develop further. It sounds like that. Is that the realization that's happening generally? I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but
no, I mean there are many things happening. So when I prepared the book that you mentioned before, so I wrote it in 2023. It was published last year. I wouldn't say that many people wanted to make the case that the humanities would be more important given the rise of generative AI. I think a few people were saying that. What happens, and I believe that my book is absolutely not the reason for that, what happens is what you mentioned, that suddenly we have a conversation that is shifting slightly. And that is recognizing the value of humanistic training. So that's quite interesting that it would happen right now. I would like to take credit for it, but I don't think I can. However, what I might be speaking about very soon is precisely this question of the deep importance of the humanities for the kind of generative AI we have today. Strangely enough, I don't think this was well recognized. I'm not sure it is well recognized today, but it might play a role. I also believe that although we may have our issues with the tech world and the tech companies, and I have those issues pretty strongly, and with the kind of potential dictatorship we could enter if things continue a certain path. There are lots of very smart people there who may have noticed that if nobody is reading, well, things are problematic. Some people might have noticed as well that the more we train our large language models on the basis of what is sometimes called polluted data, that is data generated by the large language models, the more we do that, the more the performance is disappointing. So there is suddenly a realization of that, which in itself is enough to convince smart people within the tech sector that what is generated by a computer is not really there yet, or not at the level of not of a human, because the problem is not so much the human versus the machine, which is part of the issue we have, especially with the Turing test. As it is designed, it's more like a sort of either or. But if we believe, which is something I oftentimes wrote about, if we believe that there are different ways of speaking, different ways of thinking, different ways of using language, then necessarily there are different ways of being human and different ways of humanizing language. And the humanities, it's not necessarily the term I would have selected to refer to what I sometimes call the discursive disciplines, but that's the term we have, and there is a good reason to keep it rather than trying to come up with a new label. The humanities, from the early origin of a term that is closely tied to the conceptions we have, at least in the West, but there is something similar in China to some extent, it has been within that circle with Cicero and other Roman thinkers as a reference to the fact that the humanities would change us, would transform us. And the fact that the humanities would transform their practitioners is very different from many areas of knowledge where you are being, if you wish, modified by the new knowledge you are acquiring, but not transformed on a personal basis. It is true that not the entirety of the humanities is transformative. It is true that many humanities classes could be boring. That's completely true. But we have the promise within the humanities of not just modifying, not just changing, but also transforming yourselves. And that's also what is the promise of the art and the promise of literature. And in this respect, we might lose some of the meaning of the transformation if we just go back to something that we now call, thanks to the engineering community, in fact, a generation. And I'm very grateful for the engineers to have said that the large language models were generative AI and not creative AI, because then my task would be more difficult. But that's great. We have that term, generation, that I like. It's generation, and it's not necessarily creation.
Cool. Great. That that's that's great insight to this phenomena and these realizations that people are having. I'm totally with you on sci-fi. I also cut my teeth as a child on sci-fi, and it kind of gave me sort of a macro view of civilizations because we had all these different civilizations, right? There were the ones that were
Of course.
away from the earth and they came here. And so here we are. We're all one place. We're all one group of people. And and AI, of course, has been part of that for a long time. So I've been exposed to that notion through a number of books and films and so forth. And so this is kind of a, just the arrival of a future that's been imagined. I don't want to say predicted, but imagined for a long time. And yet we don't seem really ready for it. But here we are. So, okay, please proceed. Thank you. This is a really good opening.
So I think you can see my slides now.
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm beginning with an anecdote. I'm going to explain that we are launching a new book series. Since I'm speaking to librarians, it could be of interest, but I will tell more about that. But I was spending, as usual, thanks to the wonderful state of air transportation in the US, spending 7 hours in a connection in Detroit Airport, which is at least a nice airport, in August. And I was working on the final touches of the manuscript, collective manuscript about the future of creation and scholarship in AI-dominated world. And it happened to coincide when I was reading the news in that airport with the official launch of GPT-5, and with Sam Altman saying that GPT-5 was now at a legitimate PhD level expert. That's the quote you have. And of course, I was annoyed by that. But a specificity of the book is that it includes responses to a short question by human thinkers, but also by all kinds of generative systems. So I thought that I could add GPT-5 to the list, potentially. Unfortunately, GPT-5 gave me, so the question is, what is the future of creation and or scholarship in AI-dominated world? So GPT gave me a very useless response because it didn't understand the prompt. I mean, the only out of 16 systems that didn't completely understand the prompt. And then it gave me the talking points, I would say, that you would expect. That, for instance, in an AI-dominated world, creation and scholarship will not disappear into algorithmic sameness, or that you should treat AI as a new kind of colleague. So everything was pretty bland. I mean, we had already that coming from the systems. It was exactly what you would expect big tech would tell you. And I was quite disappointed by the performance, but I thought that maybe a picture would be better. So I asked the system, which was telling me that there would be an era of friendship and companionship between creators, scholars, and AI. I asked the system to turn that text into a black and white image. The first attempt was to turn it into a PDF, which was not very successful. But the second attempt suddenly revealed visually the truth of the absolute companionship. And that's what GPT-5 presented to me as the future of creation and scholarship in a world that would be dominated by AI. So that's one possibility. We know that it could really be the case. But I'm trying in Humanities in the Time of AI to present something a bit different. So it's Humanities in the Time of AI is a short book because that's the principle of the series, Forerunners series with the University of Minnesota Press that has published it. It's a book that could be, it's a real book. It could be bought, but it's also online and free via Manifold, which is allowing access to digitized content. So it's a reflection on the intersection between the humanities and AI, but it's also a reflection on what we could call the humanities. But it has ties with the experiment I mentioned briefly before, the experiment on GPT-3, excuse me, and poetry that Morten Christiansen and I conducted together a few years ago at Cornell with two of our graduate students at the time, who are now doctors or almost. And I wrote an essay, narrative and theoretical essay on the experiment that you can read if you wish. It was published 2 years ago in Harper's magazine in an issue that was entitled "Resisting AI." So that taught me quite a lot, especially about the level of creation and generation, about the very high level of efficient productivity the system could reach, and all the things that the system could not do. I mean, GPT, but it's not restricted to it. Also mentioning more briefly that we had a very technical paper which I co-designed and co-authored on the evolution of language, and to see if we could take one word, which is a very important political word, indigenous in French, that has served as a political imperial category, and that has been reclaimed afterwards in the same way we have indigenous in English. But we wanted to see if AI methods could deliver us a snapshot of this very rich, very specific evolution in terms of meaning of one term. And my interest from the start, when Iman Termina, my colleague, and I began discussing the topic, was to show that artificial intelligence could capture some of those changes, but that some of the most important, most relevant ones are just outside of the techniques today. But my point is that they are for structural reasons outside of the techniques in general. You may have thought, I mean, you mentioned, Don, that your group began with the pandemic. I guess many people during the pandemic read again Gabriel Garcia Marquez' novel on love in the times, if you want to stay true to the Spanish original, in the times of cholera. And you may have noticed that Humanities in the Time of AI is reproducing or changing the structure of the term of the title of Garcia Marquez' book. The idea in Garcia Marquez' novel is not unlike the sentiment that undergirds the beautiful movie by Marguerite Duras and Alain Resnais, Hiroshima Mon Amour, Hiroshima My Love. And so the idea in Garcia Marquez and in Resnais and Duras is not that we need plagues, epidemics, or the atomic bomb to encounter love, but that even in times of epidemic, plagues, and the atomic bomb, we can have love. And so that's a bit what I'm saying, that even in the time of AI, which might to some extent be a sort of plague or weapon of mass destruction, we can have the possibility of strengthening, not just saving the humanities or defending them, but in fact strengthening them. So I'm not known to be an optimist. People who know me would not define me in this way, but I decided to display a sort of paradoxical optimism on this question, because I think that we may have collectively erred a little bit about what we could ask humanistic scholarship to provide and to do, and that in a sense the upheaval that necessarily generative AI and the AI mining, which is not new but is now much enlarged of what would be the traditional objects of culture and the arts, that all of those phenomena could be put in contrast with a different way of thinking of the humanities. I want to say very clearly that, unfortunately, and we see that happening right now in different countries. Unfortunately, the rise of generative AI could be used in a shrewd way by people who have power, academic power especially. It could be used as a shrewd way to let go of the humanities or to downsize. It could be done in this way. Unfortunately, it will be done in this way. But the paradoxical optimism I'm selecting is coming from the fact that I believe that the meaningfulness, that the significance of the humanities is not in danger. What might be in danger, however, is the infrastructure of the humanities. So that's the right moment to explain why it would be a mistake. So there are some elements in some claims in the book. First, I want to reclaim a view of the humanities that is maximalist. So we should not just say that we're here for adornment, for instance. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of transforming how we think. I adopt a transhistorical and transcultural view of the humanities. I'm not ignorant of the fact that the term humanities is coming with a history, but I believe that the task of the humanities, which is different from the term, despite local historical circumstances, is very transhistorical and very transcultural. Unfortunately, some relatively recent books in the US, very serious books about the history of the humanities, it's a very American thing, tend to consider that the humanities are mainly an invention of the Cold War in the American universities. So I'm absolutely against that. That's very clear. So humanities being understood as a set of disciplines that are epistemic, that are bringing knowledge, although the knowledge in question is not necessarily a purely objective one, but we don't know exactly if we ever reach that purely objective one. So disciplines of knowledge that are discursive, that is, they are about discourse, but they also produce discourse. They are about interpretation and about signification. And since we have generation now, it is time to focus again, in my view, on creation, but creation being defined as different from generation. I'm coming back to that in a few seconds. Creation as a subject and an object. That is, there is an object of creation, but a subject at stake. That's the transformative part that I mentioned. And it is also true that in every kind of knowledge, and maybe every kind of society, we have things that we might call bureaucratic operations. The term bureaucratic operations of the mind is in fact coming from a mathematician, Jean-Yves Girard, who refers to a part of the mathematical work that is not the non-creative part as bureaucratic. That is, you write, you have the genius insight, if you wish, and you have the vision of the demonstration, but then you need to write it. There are bureaucratic operations everywhere. And it might be AI that would, to some extent, do some of that. Although I must say that today it's not necessarily what is happening, but it could happen. For instance, in terms of transcribing paleographic writings, in terms of editing, we might have a sort of collaboration with AI that would outsource some of the bureaucratic operations, but would still leave to us the work of meaningfulness. But again, we're not completely there yet, and that's not necessarily Claude or DeepSeek that will help you there. Of course, if we say that we should focus on creation, we should have a strong view of creation, which is the view I'm trying to defend. I have been trying to defend for quite some time, in fact, before I would really be into the large language models, even before they would exist as they are now through their architecture. So if we say that innovation is a term for making novelty, how do we produce novelty? I mean, there are many different ways of doing that. And I believe in the virtue of pluralism at the level of concepts, at least. So you can do something novel through random association. If you're thinking of some of the 20th century avant-gardes, from Dada Surrealism to the Beat generation, you have a desire to give something new through a random association. So, and in our lives, we sometimes find something without thinking about it. Trial and error across animal species is a very common way of finding something new. But you see that random association, trial and error, are not reducible to each other. Invention, by invention I would think of token variation, recombination, rearranging. That is, you have something and you are displacing the logic of something. Invention is still different. And I'm asking the question, where is generation there? And for me, creation is not just a way of adding variation, but it's a way of knowing the frame and exceeding the frame, if you wish. And I believe that if we look at the history of AI, I mean, the relatively recent history of AI, I will go a bit backward in time in a few minutes, but in the 1990s, you had, for instance, a debate between Margaret Bowden on the one hand and Douglas Hofstadter on the other hand. And the debate was about creation. And those debates have, to a large extent, been crushed by the success of the large language models, where suddenly people were a bit forced to admit that generation might be the term for any of those different things. And I believe that those different labels are not reducible to each other, and that therefore we should insist on their differences and see exactly what we have as a phenomenon in the emergence of the new through the large language models. That means also redefining intelligence. Intelligence is a very complex, very complex concept, a category that is coming with all kinds of problems that we know about, with the exclusion of intelligence and so on. But etymologically, you have across, and you have that term legere, which is related to a root, Indo-European root, that is very interesting. So in Greek, that root, that's the root of selection and linkage. In Greek, that root will give way to lego, and logos, which is a reference to speech, because it's the selection and the linkage of words or ideas in a flux, in a stream of voice. That's for the Greek. In Latin, lego means also selecting and linking, but it will mainly be used for reading. And in the Romance languages, we still use that term for reading, in fact. So the kind of artificial intelligence we have is more like a mode of selection and linkage of things across themselves. But it could also be a way of reading between the lines, and that might be a bit more, a bit further away from what AI is able to do. What I want to insist upon is that AI is us, and at the same time, we are not AI. By this, I mean AI is us because because AI remains a human endeavor. Because the kind of self-learning algorithms that we have are self-learning, but just to a certain point. And of course, because the generative AI we mainly speak of today, the large language models, rely on all the things that humans have been doing. On top of that, I believe that AI is us in the sense that some of the critiques I could make of the bad poems written by GPT are critiques I could make of many bad poems written by humans as well. It's not as if humans were reinventing themselves constantly. That's really not the case. So we are very repetitive, very predictable in many aspects. What I'm saying is that we are also something else, and we should not forget the something else. And the something else is more like the exception to the rule, which by definition means it will not happen all the time. True. But that's not just a statistical element out of distribution we should forget about. And we are not AI precisely because we can be more than that. So here I'm speaking about the role of the humanities, if you wish, to a large extent, but not only the humanities. Why do we have the kind of generative AI we have now, and why do we have this advent of a new tool? I will begin with the idea in the middle. We have technical, and I should also say capitalistic, I guess, advances. The method that is called deep learning, the technique called word-to-vec, which transforms words into so-called semantic vectors, the transformer architecture without which we would not have our own system like GPT and others. So we have those technical advances, and without them, I mean, word-to-vec is a 21st century technique, for instance. Transformer architecture is very recent. Without those very recent technical advances, we would not speak of the rise of generative AI. But what is important to acknowledge as well is that in the same way you could have engineering novelty that depends on previously purely speculative conjectures and ideas brought forward by mathematicians. The very basis of treating language as an object and of believing that meaning could be a calculation of statistical occurrences across in a text, I mean, those ideas are coming to us from theoretical configurations that are really mathematical, but also very, very largely humanistic. And especially the move that I'm going to just briefly mention before, from philology to the rise of linguistics in the 20th century, and the fact that language would not be a sacred object, would not be a form of life. I mean, all kinds of other paradigms that existed and that still exist to think of language, but language could be treated as an object. And of course, we have the infrastructure changes. For instance, if we didn't do previously the mass digitization of the print material, as we did in libraries and with Google, it would be much more difficult to, if not impossible, but to suddenly have those very vast corpora that are absolutely essential to the training of the big models. I add in plus theft, because we know that a large number of books that were under copyright or content that was under copyright was probably used in the training of some of the large language models we have. So that leads me to the idea that we have a sort of shared responsibility, or if you absolutely hate generative AI, then we have a shared guilt. So it's not just the capital, it's not just the government, if you're thinking more of the Chinese example. It's not just the tech community that gave us generative AI as we know it. It's also fundamental research in mathematics and logical forms, for instance. Humanistic scholarship, that is the invention of linguistics. And it's also librarians. And since I'm invited by the librarians, I have to tell them that we are all responsible. It's also the librarian community through a certain relation to digitization that also fueled the situation. So it's not to say that we should just repeat mea culpa, mea culpa. It's more like a way of saying, if we have done those things, and some of them we didn't know they would lead to that, we can also undo them, or we are also we have at least equal legitimacy when we are critical of AI. Because without humanities, without people asking themselves what is the meaning of this very strange Greek term in a manuscript, and then by and by leading the way for the new science of linguistics, without librarians trying to make use of an extension of the book through its digitization and its sharing, without some of those elements, we wouldn't have the generative AI we today encounter. Therefore, we should be empowered in this debate. So that's what I will skip that, I think, but that's the move, for instance, on the epistemology of language that turned language as something that could be an object and then gradually a sort of almost a tool, I would say. And that's the question we have now facing us, and that's really a very humanistic question. It's about reductionism and pluralization. Does it serve us to have multiple concepts, multiple names for relating to what might appear to be the same reality? There might be a tendency to say if we use 3 or 4 terms to refer to something that looks pretty much the same, it's a mistake, and that's more scientific to reduce the problem. What I'm saying is that one part of what we do in the humanities is to complexify the language we use, to open it up. And I believe there is a very strong virtue in opening things up. In this respect, innovation, invention, generation, creation, as I was showing before, should not be considered to be the exact same thing. I also believe that in the same way, information, knowledge, science, scholarship are not necessarily reducible to each other. That doesn't mean that we would have concepts that are absolutely unrelated to each other, but that there is a virtue in pluralizing the language we use. In this respect, I believe we make a mistake, and that's a mistake that we have been making collectively, I would say. If we make a mistake if we reduce books to document or to data. If we reduce text to just information, or teaching to instruction, or thinking or thought to computation. Since I said I went onto the memory lane, and so when I was in middle school, for instance, the library in the middle school ceased to be called a library. It became a center for documentation and information. It was a new thing in the 80s for France. And we speak of library and information science. There are all kinds of good reasons why we would do that, because the book form is not the only support. So that's obvious. I mean, I have no critique there. But then the next question is, why did we select information? And information was selected largely due to the rise of information theory and Claude Shannon first. But then Shannon very clearly said that information was not a concept that had to do with meaning. And so by doing as if we could reduce text or knowledge to information, we might contribute, perhaps unwittingly, but we might contribute down the line to a sort of downsizing, a shrinkage of the potentialities that our lives could offer. So that's why I believe in the pluralization of the 3 orders I mentioned in the previous slide. That is pluralization of the theoretical, the technical, and the infrastructure. Where I'm not working much on the pluralization of the infrastructure, but it's true that this is a question for the libraries. The pluralization of the technical, we know right now that it is a big question in generative AI. With reasoning models, do they bring something else? With the mixture of experts, is it really very different from the other architectures and so on? But my main task as a scholar and a teacher is with the pluralization of the theoretical, because I believe that if we propose different kinds of partage, as we say in French, different kind of sharing and cutting down the reality we face, we might gain something from it by seeing precisely those exceptional, unusual, irregular moments that an impoverishment of language would tend to conceal. So I'm just ending by saying that we are launching with Cornell University Press a series of books. It's entitled Mechanema, and so you will see that my Greek self expressed some reality there in the selection of that term. Mechanema is a very interesting term. It has to do with the machine, but it could also be an impediment, which is why I chose it. So it's a new book series where we consider short, incisive, and thought-provoking books on AI and the humanities. First volume with a different title, but some of those people here on the book cover will be The Future of Creation and Scholarship. And it will be out in December or January, so December of this year or January of 2027. It might be very interesting to reflect on libraries as well. In a volume, we have a single-authored volume or collective volume, and so I'm happy to discuss any of this as well. It's a non-dogmatic. I tend to have sharp opinions, but it's a non-dogmatic series, and we are 5 people working at it, although I'm leading the effort. And I thank you for your attention.
Wonderful, Laurent. So much to think about, so many avenues off of your core topics. One thing that hits me is you mentioned this random association. I mean, this is kind of the creativity generation issue. As a vehicle for creative thought or creation itself. At the same time, there's a phenomena of pattern recognition in vast amounts of information that yields some new thought or new idea. And how would you distinguish the resulting ideas from the source of the generation? So it could be the same idea that was created by a random association of a creative person, or it could be created by a pattern recognition that AI uniquely is capable of doing because of the scale of its ability to scan information. So how it came is different, but what it looks like might be exactly the same. No?
Oh, yeah, you could have relatively similar results. So there are many questions in your question, I would say. I mean, one of them, you saw on the slide, I was asking on the side, where is generation? Because generation, I believe, is not only invention, it's not only one thing or the other. I do not believe that generation could lead to what I call creation, or at least not with the kind of architectures we have, but it could be multiple things. If we think of this article with Emily Bender as a first author that has been heavily quoted on the stochastic parrot, attacking the large language models as being stochastic parrots. The idea here was that what large language models were doing was mostly repeating, slightly reshuffling, and adding, that's the stochastic element, adding random variations, if you wish. So it would be mostly rehashing plus random variations, random associations. I would say my life would be easier if that were true. I would be happy in a world where large language models were just stochastic parrots. So I have an interest in believing that. But unfortunately, that's not what I see. And when I began working, when we began working on the poetry generation, that became quite clear that there was much more recitation, for instance, than what was officially recognized at the time. Now it has been shown by computer engineers that the large language models can recite word for word entire segments of text, but that was supposedly not possible when we were working on it. So we have that recitation, but it's not just the stochastic part. It's not just repetition of the said with a little bit of variation. So I tend to say, so that's the difference in terms of innovation, if you wish. It is true that, for instance, André Breton and the surrealists, who believed in what they called automatic writing, and who believed in the unleashing power for imagination of the most random association of terms or objects, they selected automatic writing. That is, the hope of the surrealists was that something that would just dismantle every humanhood or every aspect of humanness would lead to a sort of new creation, would allow people to get rid of the ready-made conventions. And you have a few thinkers and poets today, a few artists who would claim similarly that AI could deliver us from what is usually portrayed as a very romantic and very dated vision of the creativity of the artist. So I don't believe this is what is going to happen. I don't believe that creation is an idea that is coming with Romanticism. It's an idea that is stronger with Romanticism, but it has been with us in many different cultures and many different historical eras. So I have no problem with reclaiming it. The last question in your question was, does it make a difference? Does it make a difference, excuse me, if we have the exact same result through an automated procedure and through a different approach? Well, one point, there are two sides to this. One point is, could we have the exact same result? And in my view, we don't have the exact same result. At least when we speak about creation. When we speak about random variation, in fact, it wouldn't be random completely. But so for some aspects, strangely enough, generation would not give us the same thing. But then what we are beginning to discover, and to go back to this new interest coming from the tech sector and from funding agencies in the humanities vis-à-vis AI, there is this new realization that there is also a mental process, that writing and reading are not just done as activities that have a given outcome. That is, we don't just read a book to be able to summarize the characters, the plot, or the ideas. We also read the book to be transformed by the act of reading the book. The goal of writing is not just to make things done, but also to have a mental process through writing and through the difficulty of writing that is allowing us to enlarge our ways of thinking and to be even smarter, more open-minded, and so on. And those things are disappearing if we just believe that the outcome is what matters. I mean, that's the real problem we are all seeing right now in higher education. Recently at Cornell, discussion with that was supposed to be with humanists and scientists about teaching in AI, but it ended up being, I ended up being the only humanist. But all of the scientists in the room were saying, our students can no longer read. But can no longer read what? Including a mathematical demonstration, including a paper in physics. And if we believe that the erasure of reading is going to do us any kind of good, I believe we are really mistaken there.
Oh, well, we have run over our hour. It has just blazed by. It's incredible. I can't believe it's been an hour. If I wasn't looking at the clock, I wouldn't think we'd been half that way. So I'm gonna close with a question on the outlook for libraries and AI. Do you see some type of a unique combination between these two information inventions, I guess we can call them? The library very old and AI very new, but they have so much overlap and underpinnings. How do you see the is there a unique coevolution of these two phenomena that you see?
If AI is evolving as a sort of parasitic tool, it could be argued that AI would swallow the library, which in a sense is what is happening. That you have not everything that has been in print, but you have a lot of what has been in print and digitized in the largest systems, at least. The mistake there would be to forget about the direct access to that is, it's not the same to read Homer and to read the summary of Homer or even the pastiche of Homer, because now some of these texts are quite able to produce Homeric lines in a row. So there, you have the anxious future. Let's say that the library is just being a part of the fuel and the food for the AI machinery. But if we think of the library as being completely digitized, it is obvious that we can now, for 20 years of my life, I was working almost every day as a scholar in the library. Now it's also true that I can work more often at home because I can have access to many more books online than even 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But the library is also a place, that really struck me when I was in my alma mater in France. As strange as it could sound, most academic libraries in France are not OpenStack. Most of them you receive the books that are being delivered. So my alma mater, the École Normale, was the only, at the time when I was a student, it's a bit different now, was the only very large scholarly library, research library, where you would go and pick up the books. And that's really something that is absolutely essential to us. We do encounter with the books, but we also do encounter with the people. And that's also what the library is providing us with a space. So I believe the future of the library, I hope there will be tons of books in the future library, because I like my books and I like them to be in the library as well. But there is also a space for a new kind of creativity and new kind of dialogue that should be what the library is about.
Wonderful. That is a great closing argument, statement, hope. And I couldn't agree more, as a place and a unique place in every community for people. Uh, and so I want to thank you very much, Laurent. This has been fascinating.
Thank you for the invitation.
We'll
Really.
have the recording up in a day or two, and we often get more than double the number of people watching the recordings than attend the actual live sessions. We're approaching some 25,000 recording views on our YouTube channel of all the sessions we've done since March 2020. And so this will be part of that. I'd love to have you back. There's so many things, many other things to talk about, people to
There are
talk
many
about.
other things to talk about.
I'd like to talk about McLuhan. I'd like to talk about, well, there's just a lot. I'd like to talk about intelligence. I think these are just tremendously fascinating topics that are just so much at the heart of your work, and you've been just a great speaker and a guest, and we appreciate it so much. Thank you, Laurent,
Thank
and
you,
we
everyone.
look forward
Thank you,
to
Laurent.
having you back at.
Let's do that.
So with that, I want to thank everybody for being here today, and we'll see you next time.
Have a good day.